Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive where we're going to be looking at some really interesting research on autism.
Yeah.
Um, we've got quite a few sources here, and they actually paint two really different pictures
Uh-uh.
of how autism has been thought about and dealt with throughout history.
Yeah.
One of them focuses on inclusion, and the other on
Oh, wow.
eradication.
Really? It's amazing how those different approaches reflect just completely different worldviews
Yeah,
and values.
absolutely. And we're also going to be talking about Dr. Grunya Sukhareva.
Okay.
She was a researcher back in the 1920s.
hmm
And her work was basically unknown in the West for decades.
Wow. Her story is such a powerful example of how, social and political forces can shape scientific knowledge.
For sure. So let's get started with this Soviet approach to autism.
Okay.
Our sources describe the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s as like a nation that was totally transforming.
Yeah.
I mean, they were rebuilding after years of war and revolution.
Right.
And there was a huge emphasis on like strength as a collective
Mm-hmm.
and, social solidarity.
In that environment, it's so interesting to see how Dr. Sukhareva's approach to autism was so different
Yeah.
from what was happening in the West at the time.
So tell me more about Dr. Sukhareva.
Yeah,
What made her work so groundbreaking?
well, unlike many of her peers at the time who saw autism as like a pathology,
Mm-hmm.
like a defect to be corrected,
Yeah.
Sukhareva saw it as a variation in human development. She was
Mhm.
really focused on understanding like the unique strengths
Yeah.
and challenges of people who were autistic.
That's a pretty radical idea for that time,
Oh, absolutely.
wasn't it?
Yeah, she was actually one of the first researchers to differentiate autism from epilepsy,
Oh, wow.
which was huge
Yeah.
for understanding autism as its own separate thing.
What were some of her observations about autistic people?
Oh, yeah.
Our sources mention that she was really interested in how they thought and interacted with the world.
Yes. So her work really emphasized the detailed observations and in-depth case studies she did.
Yeah.
Like, for example, she noted autistic children's heightened sensory sensitivities,
Yeah.
their unique ways of playing and learning,
Right.
and their difficulty with social communication.
Right.
But instead of seeing these as deficits,
Mhm.
she recognized them as different ways of experiencing and interacting with the world.
So how did this perspective translate into the Soviet approach to autism?
Well,
Was there a push for inclusion?
yes, very much so.
Okay.
The Soviet system, with its focus on collective well-being,
Mhm.
really tried to integrate all individuals into society,
Mhm.
including those with disabilities.
Interesting.
There was this strong belief in the value of every person's contribution,
Yeah.
no matter their differences.
It sounds like a very different world from the one we live in today,
Yeah.
where it feels like individualism and competition are prized above all else.
It really is a stark contrast. And that difference in ideology really impacted how each system dealt with autism.
Mm.
The Soviets saw value in every individual
Yeah.
and really wanted to make a society where everyone could participate and contribute.
So while Dr. Sukhareva was making these groundbreaking observations
Right.
and advocating for inclusion in the Soviet Union,
Mm-hmm.
what was happening in the West,
Good question.
our sources suggest that her work was essentially erased
Yeah.
from Western scientific literature.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Despite publishing her research in German,
Yeah.
which was widely read in the scientific community at the time,
Uh-huh.
her work was largely ignored in the West.
Why do you think that was?
Well, I think there were a few things going on.
Okay.
The Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and the West definitely didn't help.
Yeah, there was a lot of mistrust and ideological conflict during that era.
Exactly. And you also have to remember the prevailing patriarchal norms
Right.
in Western science at the time.
It was still very much a boys' club, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And as a woman working in a rival system,
Right.
Sukhareva faced a real uphill battle to get her work recognized.
Yeah.
It was just overlooked or dismissed.
It's a classic example of how societal biases can shape what we consider to be valid scientific knowledge.
Totally. And this erasure of Sukhareva's work really impacted the direction of autism research in the West.
Because it allowed for a much more a view of autism as a pathology
Exactly.
to take hold.
Figures like Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger,
Mm.
who were both men working in the West,
Yeah.
became known as like the fathers of autism research.
Right.
Even though Sukhareva's work came before theirs.
And their perspective on autism was quite different.
Yes.
Yeah.
Their work tended to frame autism in much more negative terms,
Okay.
focusing on deficits and impairments instead of strengths and differences.
So in a way, the erasure of Sukhareva's work kind of paved the way for a more medicalized
Yes.
and deficit-focused approach to autism to become the main one in the West. I think that's a good way to put it, and that legacy is still felt today.
Wow, it's almost like a historical cover-up,
Yeah,
isn't it?
it is.
The West missed out on such a valuable perspective
Yeah.
that could have shaped our understanding of autism in a much more humane
Mm-hmm.
and inclusive way.
For sure.
But before we get into that, let's talk about this recent article
Yeah.
in Molecular Psychiatry that you mentioned.
Yeah.
It seems to tie into this whole conversation about how we see
It does.
and approach autism.
Yeah, this article really shows how the historical context we've been discussing is still relevant today.
Yeah.
You know, this article really highlights how scientific research can be influenced by, like the social and political ideologies of the time.
You're talking about that study on neuropilin 2 and its link to autism and epilepsy, right?
Yeah.
To be honest, when I first read that article, it just seemed like any other genetic research.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really get why it was so concerning.
Yeah, well, on the surface, it seems like a step forward in understanding the biology of autism. Yeah.
But if we look a little deeper, we can see how it fits into a much bigger and more troubling story.
Okay, I need some help understanding this.
Sure.
So what exactly is neuropilin 2?
Okay, so neuropilin 2,
Yeah.
it's a protein that's involved in the development of the nervous system.
Okay.
And this particular study suggests that variations in the gene that makes neuropilin 2 could increase the chance of developing both autism and epilepsy.
So they're suggesting that there's a genetic link between these two conditions.
Exactly. And that's where things get a bit tricky.
Okay.
By focusing only on the genetic level, this research kind of reinforces the idea that autism is like a biological defect,
Right.
a problem that needs to be fixed, at the DNA level.
And that plays into the whole, cure narrative that's been so big in autism research.
Exactly. It feeds into this idea that we need to find ways to identify and get rid of these faulty genes.
Right.
Either through prenatal testing or some kind of genetic intervention. Which brings us back to eugenics.
Yeah.
You mentioned that term earlier. Can you explain what it means
Sure.
and how it relates to what we're talking about?
So eugenics is basically the idea of trying to improve the human population by controlling breeding.
Okay.
And it's often connected with those awful policies in Nazi Germany,
Right.
where people with disabilities, including autistic people, were sterilized
Oh, wow.
or even killed to try and eliminate what they saw as undesirable traits.
That's a terrifying part of history.
It is.
But are you saying that those ideas are still around today,
I think so.
even if they're not as openly expressed?
Absolutely.
Wow.
While we've thankfully moved away from those horrible things that happened during the Nazi era,
Yeah.
the underlying idea of categorizing and eliminating difference is still there in many parts of society,
Yeah.
including scientific research.
So even though this molecular psychiatry article doesn't directly advocate for eugenics,
No.
you're worried that it could be used to support those kinds of practices.
It's a slippery slope for sure.
Yeah.
When we reduce autism to just a set of genes that need fixing, it creates a dangerous way of thinking about neurodiversity.
Okay.
It suggests that autistic people are inherently broken
Right.
and that the solution is to just get rid of autism altogether.
That's so dehumanizing.
It is.
It completely ignores the lived experiences of autistic people.
Yeah.
Their strengths, their talents, their unique perspectives on the world.
Exactly. And it doesn't address the real issues
Mhm.
that actually make life difficult for autistic people.
Like what?
Things like lack of access to good health care and education,
Right.
social stigma and discrimination,
Yeah.
and economic inequality.
So it's not just about this research being used for bad purposes.
Right.
It's also that it distracts us from dealing with the actual challenges
Yes.
that autistic people face every day.
That's right.
That's a really good point.
And this is exactly why it's important to think about the bigger picture, the social and political context when we look at scientific research.
Yeah.
It's never just about the data. It's always about the values and assumptions that shape how we understand that data
Right.
and what we choose to do with it.
Okay, so we've talked about how this molecular psychiatry article reflects a very limited and potentially harmful view of autism.
Yes.
But what about this idea of neurodiversity?
Right.
How does that fit into all of this?
The concept of neurodiversity is so important here
Okay.
because it challenges the whole idea that autism is something to be fixed or eliminated. It says that there are lots of ways of being human,
Yeah.
lots of ways of experiencing and interacting with the world,
Right.
and that these differences should be celebrated,
Yeah.
not pathologized.
It's about having a wider view of what normal means.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. It's about recognizing that there's no one right way to be human, and that the richness and complexity of human society come from all these different minds and experiences.
That's a really powerful message.
It is.
But I've also heard the term neurodiversity being used in ways that feel kind of,
Yeah.
I don't know, superficial.
Right.
Like some companies are talking about their neurodiversity initiatives,
Mm-hmm.
but it sometimes feels like more of a marketing thing than a real commitment to inclusion.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And it really shows one of the dangers of using the language of social justice movements without actually changing the systems of oppression underneath.
So how can we tell the difference between genuine efforts to promote neurodiversity?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about, like a more superficial or even exploitative approach, I think it comes down to who benefits from these initiatives.
Okay.
Are they actually making life better for autistic people?
No.
Or are they just making companies look good
Right.
without changing anything about how they do things?
So a truly inclusive approach to neurodiversity would need to go beyond just hiring a few autistic people
Yes,
and putting a nice statement on their website.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It would require a fundamental shift in how we think about work productivity and success.
Okay.
It would mean valuing different ways of thinking and working, accommodating sensory sensitivities,
Yeah.
and creating environments where everyone feels safe and supported to be themselves.
It's almost like we need to rethink the whole structure of work
Yeah.
to really accommodate neurodiversity.
I think you're right.
Wow.
We need to move away from that rigid one-size-fits-all model that
Yeah.
you see in most workplaces
Right.
and embrace a more flexible and individualized approach.
And that would benefit everyone,
Yes.
not just autistic people.
Exactly.
Wow.
When we create environments that are more inclusive and accommodating of different ways of being,
Yeah.
we make a better world for everyone.
It's interesting how all of this connects back to Dr. Sukhareva's work in the Soviet Union. Despite the problems and flaws of that system,
Yeah.
it seems like they were onto something with their focus on inclusion and collective well-being.
I think that's a really valuable insight. It
Yeah.
shows how important it is to learn from different historical and cultural perspectives. We can't just assume that our way of doing things is the best or only way.
So we've talked about a lot today.
We have?
We've explored the different approaches to autism in the Soviet Union and the West,
Yes.
the fact that Dr. Sukhareva's work was erased,
Uh-huh.
the concerning implications of the molecular psychiatry article,
Yeah.
and how complicated neurodiversity is in a capitalist society.
It's complex.
What are some key things you hope people listening will take away from this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that autism is not a single experience.
Yeah.
There's so much diversity within the autism spectrum,
Right.
and it's crucial to recognize and value that diversity.
And that means moving away from this deficit-based model that's been so dominant in autism research for so long.
Exactly. We need to change our focus from fixing autistic people to understanding and supporting them.
Yeah.
That means listening to autistic voices,
Right.
respecting their self-determination, and creating a world where they can truly thrive.
And that brings us back to Hans Asperger,
Yes.
whose work, as we talked about before, is really tied up with the horrors of the Nazi regime.
It is.
This part of the story feels especially relevant to our discussion about the molecular psychiatry article,
Yeah.
because it reminds us that scientific research can be used for good or for evil.
It's a powerful reminder that science is never neutral.
Right,
It's
right.
always influenced by the social and political context it's happening in. And it can be used to either strengthen or challenge the power structures that already exist.
And that means we have to be very careful about how we interpret and use scientific findings, especially when it comes to something as complex as autism.
Absolutely. We need to be vigilant in challenging any attempts to use science to justify discrimination or exclusion.
So as we move forward, how do we make sure that autism research is done ethically
Right.
and that it benefits autistic people instead of harming them?
Well, one crucial step is to make sure autistic people's voices are heard and research and policy decisions.
It's about recognizing that autistic people are the experts on their own lives and experiences.
Exactly.
Right.
Their perspectives are essential to shaping a more just and inclusive future for all autistic people.
And that means moving away from that top-down approach.
Yeah.
That's been so common in autism research,
Yeah.
and embracing a more collaborative and community-driven model.
It's about working with artistic individuals and organizations, involving them in every step of the research process.
Right.
From designing studies to interpreting results and sharing what they've found.
And it's about ensuring that research funding priorities
Yes.
actually reflect the needs and priorities of the autistic community.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to stop focusing on finding cures and instead focus on understanding how to create a world where autistic people can thrive. That means putting money into research that looks at autistic strengths, talents, and perspectives,
Right.
as well as the social and environmental factors that can either help or hinder their well-being.
And it means challenging the ableist assumptions that are at the root of so much of our thinking
Yes.
about disability and difference.
It's about recognizing that autistic people aren't broken or defective, but rather differently wired.
Right.
And that their unique ways of being can make our society better in so many ways.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, it feels like we're at a crucial point in the history of autism research and advocacy.
Right, I agree. We have a real chance to break free from the harmful things of the past and create a more just and inclusive future for all autistic people.
It's a future where autistic voices are heard and respected.
Yes.
Where their contributions are valued and where they're fully included in all parts of social and civic life.
It's a future where neurodiversity is not just tolerated, but celebrated as a source of strength and creativity.
And I think Dr. Sukhareva, despite being silenced for so long, offers a really powerful vision for how we can get there.
Her work reminds us that inclusion isn't just about social justice. It's also about seeing the value and potential in every human being, no matter their differences.
So as we keep looking at these sources, let's keep that vision in mind.
Yes.
Let's explore how we can learn from the past, challenge the present, and build a future where all autistic people can thrive. We're talking about a pretty big change here, right? Like really rethinking how we approach autism research and inclusion.
It is radical in a way, because it really challenges some deep-seated ideas about what normal is and what a good or productive life looks like.
We've talked a lot about shifting the focus of autism research away from finding a cure and towards understanding and supporting autistic people as they are.
Right.
So what would that kind of research actually look like in practice?
Well, I think it would start with involving autistic people in every part of the research process. Not just as subjects, but as collaborators, advisors, co-researchers.
So making sure that the questions being asked are actually relevant
to
the real lives of autistic people.
And it would also mean studying a wider range of experiences. You know, for too long, autism research has focused on a very specific group of autistic people, usually white middle-class males who are considered high-functioning.
Can you explain what high-functioning means in this context? I've heard that term a lot. But it always seems kind of vague and maybe even misleading.
It is a tricky term. High-functioning is often used to describe autistic people who are good at masking their autistic traits. So they blend in with neurotypical society.
So they're basically hiding their autism.
Kind of, yeah. But it's important to remember that masking takes a lot of energy. And it can have serious effects on mental health and well-being.
Because they're always pretending to be someone they're not.
Exactly. It often means suppressing their natural ways of communicating and interacting, experiencing the world. And this can lead to anxiety, depression, burnout, even physical health problems.
So when we talk about changing the focus of autism research, part of that means moving away from just looking at high-functioning individuals and studying a broader range of experiences, including autistic people who might not be able to mask as well, or who might need more support.
Exactly. We need to understand the full spectrum of autism, including the experiences of those who have been historically marginalized.
And that includes people of color, women, transgender and non-binary individuals, and people with intellectual disability.
Absolutely. We need to make sure our research is inclusive and represents the full diversity of the autistic community.
So we're really talking about a huge shift.
We are.
In how we think about autism research and inclusion. But where do we even start to make these changes?
Well, one concrete step is to increase funding for research projects that are led by autistic researchers or that have a lot of input from the autistic community.
Because in the end, it's about giving autistic people more control.
Absolutely.
Over how they are studied and represented.
We need to decolonize autism research. By changing the power dynamics that have kept autistic voices out of the conversation.
And that means shifting resources and decision-making power away from those institutions and individuals
Yeah.
who have promoted harmful ideas about autism
Right.
and towards those who are really committed to the needs and perspectives of autistic people.
It's about building a fairer system
Yeah.
that recognizes the inherent worth and dignity of every autistic person.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
It has.
We've uncovered a hidden history, challenged the way we think, and even glimpsed a more inclusive future.
I agree.
For autistic people. So what's one final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I would say go out and find autistic self-advocates.
Okay.
There are so many amazing autistic writers, artists, activists, and researchers out there who are sharing their perspectives and challenging the status quo by listening to and learning from them. Yeah. We can all help create a more just and equitable world for autistic people.
That's a powerful message, and it reminds us that this conversation doesn't end here. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.